Hi, my name is Shady Atia, Professor of Sustainable Architecture and Building Technology at Liège University in Belgium, and today I'm going to talk about observation and ethnography research. Well, this presentation is part of a playlist on qualitative research methods. Don't hesitate to check previous videos on qualitative research methods. Well, I would like to start with the classification of the research methodologies. In general, we have two major research methodologies: the quantitative research methodologies, where we look at modeling, empirical, surveying, and statistics experimental approaches. And we have the qualitative research methodologies, where we are looking at different methods. And this presentation is part of a series on different research methods under the qualitative research methodology. Previously, we talked about the qualitative research, the systematic reviews, content analysis, and today we are going to talk about observation and ethnography research. Well, don't hesitate and forget that it's not only two approaches. We have a third approach, which is called the mixed research approach, where we mix qualitative with quantitative. By that, these are the three major common approaches. Well, the audience of this presentation is mainly researchers who are looking to prepare a research thesis, dissertation, or a conference or journal publication. And the objective of this presentation is to enhance your capacity to conceptualize, design, and conduct a research using observation and ethnography methods. So the question we are trying to answer here: how to generate data and how to analyze the data with this approach? What is the methodology of this particular approach? And the content will be focusing on the definition of ethnography research, data collection, data processing, how to look at the results, how to ensure rigor and validity, and what are the takeaway message for this presentation. Let's start with the introduction. Well, observation and ethnographic research. The goal of this approach is to understand a particular culture or social setting. You look at in this concept, in this context, you are looking to describe the specific patterns, customs in a culture or in individuals. You are informed of social changes or social phenomena in a specific group of people. You gather information about how users approach a task. You also can look at it is useful in uncovering and analyzing relevant user attitude and emotions. So this is very important to look at. Now, historically, social sciences emerged its origin is in the social anthropology. And historically, I don't want to cite any researcher who started this approach, because most of the time there is a tendency to look at anthropology with the fathers of anthropology coming from specific regions of the world. In reality, all over the world, even in the ancient times, in every country, in every culture, there was a civilization, there was writing. Any culture that had a writing, or they were writing, the people were writing at that time, there was anthropological research at that time, in a direct way or indirect way. And always when we dig deeper, we will find that the origin of this research is historically used in different culture or tested in different culture. And the idea here is that we try to get busy with people, how people behave, how people react, what are people doing in the certain context where they live. Well, also it has a strong link with hermeneutics, which is a way of understanding historical texts by looking at them in their cultural context. So the observation and ethnographic research is a strong and old technique, and it is used also with understanding historical text. Now, when we look at observation and ethnographic research, you will find it a technique or a method that is overlapping with different disciplines and domains. You find it in social sciences and humanities. You see it also in the user experience design with industrial designers. You find it in architecture, engineering, in the built environment. You find it in the medical and healthcare, and you find it also in the market and business research. In this context, I'm not going to cover all these domains. I'm going to approach observation and ethnographic research in the context of the architecture, engineering, and built environment studies, so that you have an idea. These are the limits of my presentation. Now, what are the methodologies of ethnographic research and observations? What are the main methodologies? Well, observation and or interaction with participants in their real environment. This is the main methodology, that you are going to set yourself in this context and you interact with the people in order to see how they are living. This is the main rule of observation. Researchers observe the ongoing behavior, and description in general, like maps, sketches, images, text, videos, and so on, resides at the core of observation and ethnography. So we are doing this kind of interaction or this observation with people so that at the end we create descriptions. And these descriptions can be in different forms. They can be images, sketches, and maps. So it's very important to look at that. Now, how can we categorize observations? Is it part of the desktop research or research related with people? Actually, it's a mix. Observation in general as a methodology is one of the most rich and mixed approaches to do studies. Because from one side you are involved with people, you are doing observations, you can do some discussions on a group level, you can interview people, you can do some surveys, and in the same time you go dig deep into online research, literature research, you can look some case studies. So it's a very mixed approach that combines different methods in order to achieve the target of living and observing people. Now, what are the characteristics of ethnographic research? As you can see, it is conducted in natural setting, number one. Number two, it is done within the field side. You need to do field visits, you need to do field work, you need to be present in the context. You cannot, it's not the desk research. It provides a holistic and systematic overview of the context. It documents the native perspectives. It describes and interprets what you are seeing and what you are observing. And it is guided by general research questions and not hypotheses. You just have general research questions. It's not a deductive approach, it's an inductive approach. And it focuses on meaning of word and images rather than numbers. And this makes it by default qualitative. Well, what are the methods that we can use? There are different methods when we do observation research. But the most common one, and the one I would like to talk about mainly today, is the participant observation. And in this sense, we are looking at undisguised or disguised observations. So you are either hidden or you are present while you are doing the observation, and the observed individuals know or not that the observer is present for the purpose of collecting information about their behavior. So this is the major approach when we do it. Definitely there is other different approaches of observation, like the structured observation and the field experiments, but this is not I'm not going to go through that in the presentation of today. Now, what are the methods that I can use for observation? I can do interviews, I can do conversational and discourse analysis, I can do documentary analysis, I can do films, photography, life histories. All have their place in this ethnographer repertoire. And in general, you have always with you your notebook with you, you are taking always note, you have your camera, you can record, you can take pictures, sometimes you can take even some sensations depending on the setting, and you're trying always to document what is around you, and you start to describe it and interpret what is behind it and analyze it. And definitely you interact with people. This is part of your methods. Now, how can I collect data in this approach? Well, as you know, we should not ever forget that when we are doing research, there's something called data collection, data processing, creation of something, understanding, concept, whatever we are creating of something, and we are testing it, we are applying it, or we are validating this understanding, for example. So it's important to keep in mind, how can I collect data? Well, you need first of all, if you are doing ethnographic research or observations, you need first of all to define the topic and the goal of your study. This is the first step to do. Then you have to identify your objective and determine what you want to observe and why. Finally, you can start your field work and you start your visiting your problem, and keep your research question in mind. And there is different methods for data collection that you can use. Different methods starting with observation, interviews on the topic studied. You can do perception surveys, You can create profiles of the people by categorizing them, trying to group them under certain profiles. You can do life histories, check their history and check what is their record of history. You can do logbooks, asking them to fill up information when they are doing that, when they are leaving that. Try to ask the people themselves to get engaged by documenting and tracing what they are doing, and then you go through these logbooks and analyze them. You can take pictures, you can do sketching. Sketching also is a very interesting approach. You can do other techniques. It's a very innovative word. So you can do historical analysis, you can do site location. There's different techniques and it never stops. But the question will be always how long it's going to take. For sure, you need to take into account that time is a limitation for this type of research, and you need to know that you need to take enough time to go in your field studies and do these kind of observations. Well, let's talk in detail about some specific type of fieldworks. Observations. Actively recording information according to a number of dimensions, such as places, people, actors, and activities. And this can be done through field visits. So this is an approach. Observation can be conducted by taking field notes, pictures, sketches, and videos. So this is the most basic way of doing observation. You can do also interviews. Interviews, whether they are structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. In this sense, I advise you to do unstructured or semi-structured interviews, and there is a presentation on how to do in-depth interviews. You can watch a video on the playlist of Qualitative Research Methods to learn more. You can also do surveys. So simply you look at the perception of people, and you're not looking here to statistical large samples with a high precision statistics. You're just looking here to get a perception. So you ask clear questions. You need to be not ambiguous about what you're doing. You use the word what, how, why. So open-ended questions, not closed questions like yes or no, ending with yes or no. You should avoid the yes and no questions. You ask like, tell me about, what do you think about, how people do that, why people do this, and so on. Use the most use most important type of questions. Don't ask a lot of questions. When you see the presentation of the survey that will be done in the future, you can learn how to do survey questions. What are the most important problems? What do you find most satisfying, challenging aspect, effective way, and so on. Another way of doing fieldwork is to keep logbooks. Logbooks are simply like these kind of books with lines, and you keep the logbook with the people that you are observing, because you will not be able to live with the people 24/7. Most probably, if you will visit them daily, some hours, weekly, some hours, you will be unable to live with them the whole time. Now, if you want to observe their behavior, you want to check when they do something, when they react to something, what is their lifestyle, what they eat, what they drink. You can ask them you bring them a logbook, and you ask them that they record themselves certain attitudes or certain phenomena they do during the day. And from this logbook, you can take it later on and start to analyze it. So it's also a very interesting approach in fieldwork, in observation research. You can also do behavior profiles. So in this sense, you are aiming to identify certain behavioral profiles. And what you do, you start to see, okay, what is the different profiles of these people, and you start to group them. You start to integrate diversity, look at different ages, look at different professionals, look at social aspects, economical aspect. You describe the interviewees, you look at their background, what is the context, what they are living, and you come with some ideal types. You look at people who are based on the profile, and you can group them. You can say simplified attitudes to characterize some objects or people. Some people are aggressive, some people are friendly, some people are busy, some people are overwhelmed, and so on. Description of the profile relationship with the ecosystem and the study subject. For example, if you want to check what is the behavior of people regarding waste management or hygiene in the street, and we see, do they throw the garbage, do they clean up something from the ground, and you start to do these profiles, and you see what are the types of people so that you can classify them. And this classification can be very helpful if you later on want to have a campaign or targeting some people in a specific context with a certain problem. As part of the behavior profiling, these are examples of 4 profiles. For example, when we talk about people are in homes, in smart homes. We did a study on inhabitants behavior in smart homes, and we found out some people are executors, some people are explorators, some people are dependent, some people are obstructors in regard to the use of technology and the Internet of Things and the connected devices in the homes. So this is an example of a behavioral profiling. Well, let's move now to the sampling. How do I do my sampling when I do observations? Well, the aim of sampling in observation is to identify the key informants. And the goal here is to have a breadth of understanding and not look at representativeness. So the size varies depending on the complexity of the inquiry, and we cannot decide that on advance. We start our fieldwork by trying to plan it early on, but we cannot be very precise with that because it depends what we found on the ground and what we found in reality. What are the types of sampling that we can find? There is the most common type of observation sampling is the non-probability sample, where we are looking rarely to representative target population, but we are looking at convenient and economical samples. These are the people we got access to, so this is the convenient sampling. We look at snowball sampling, simply that you had interviewed some person in some house, and then you ask them, do you have a sister, do you have a brother, do you have a friendly neighbor, can they host us? And this is the snowball. So you go from a house to another house to another house just by using the people's kindness to get you access to different other houses, for example, or households. You can do quota sampling, but in reality, the most common approach in observation research and ethnographic research, we do either the snowball sampling or we do the purposive sampling. The probability sampling for random sampling, cluster sampling, and systematic, this is more when we are doing systematic or field observations that are classified more under the quantitative research methods. Well, when should I stop? I am interviewing people, I'm visiting people, I'm observing some people in some households or in the street. Where should I stop? I need to understand two important definitions: saturation and heterogeneity. Saturation is simply the point at which no new concept emerge from my observations. So the data I have, the visits I did, nothing is coming out. It is already, I reach a certain optimal threshold of information. So this is saturation. Heterogeneity is simply that I make sure that your population and samples or result are different. You don't need, if you are looking at a specific group, you need to make sure that you have a certain mix, unless you are on purpose looking for homogeneity. So you are trying to focus on only one specific type of people or groups or subculture or culture where we want to observe those people. Then this can be something that is done on purpose, and you need to identify that in your research design early on, and you have to validate that from your ethical research committee, you have to validate that with your supervisor, you have to validate it with your peers to make sure that your sampling technique will be fruitful and will be make a good quality. Definitely also, as part of the observations, never underestimate the importance of describing the background and the context of the people. A lot of researchers who do ethnographic research or observations, they do the observations, but they fail to describe the context where they did the field work. It's not only about the people that you observed, it's also about the context of those people. So when you do your descriptions, it's not only that you describe the results of your observation and what kind of findings you found when you did your observation. You need necessarily also to dedicate sufficient time to describe the context of your observation and why you selected this context in general and what are the specificity of this context. Now let's talk about analysis. I am done with data collection with these different techniques I talked about. I made sure that I have a good sampling technique and I am covering a certain number of people. How can I analyze data? Ethnographic observation involved the production of highly detailed accounts of how people in a social setting lead their lives based on systematic and long-term observation and discussion with those within the setting. So it's important to engage with the people and talk with the people. It's not only you are sitting there and you are observing them, you are also talking with them in order to understand better what is behind these specific behaviors or the specific attitudes and lifestyles. There are three aspects of data analysis. Number one, the descriptions. Number two, examination of relationships across the data points. It can be done by focusing on the perception of the participant, their adaptation to a certain situation, the problems of the stakeholders in general. And the third step is to do interpretations and deep explanations based on deep understanding of the subject and the data. So also in this context, when you do observation and research with ethnographic methods, you don't need to be fast. Take your time, because to reach depths, you need to have several observations, several interactions, high quality exchanges. And from there only, you can come up with deeper interpretations that are very beneficial to us today in the research world. So it's very important to think like that. You do descriptions, you examine relationships between specific data points, and then you start to do your interpretation work. Some examples to give you an idea. This is a study of ethnographic research, and this was a study in the UK. They were looking to observe and analyze a range of intimate behaviors for females in the context of their family, in the context of their work. They were looking at the emotions, the impacts, the relationships, and the study was a 15 months field work, and it was across certain region in the UK. If you are interested, you can look at the work of Dr. Tarsim Singh Kuner, for example. That's an example. Another example study also is that here we did a certain investigation for thermal comfort in the summer, and we looked at specific behavior of people and how they adapt to the overheating in houses. And we investigated the aeration, how they turn on or how they use natural ventilation, they open the windows, how they keep the air quality, how they manage the heat, what they do they close the curtains, close the windows, what they have as measures, what do they have as clothing, how they change and adapt with the clothing, what they do with the different shading protection, solar shading protection internally or externally. Do they have any devices that helps with cooling, fans, and so on? So this is an interesting ethnographic observation study that required that we visit certain number of houses in a specific city and come up with information related to that. This study was done in Cairo, and it was very interesting because we learned a lot about the behavior, how people eat, how people wear, what they do, when they sleep, sometimes even when they have social problems and when they fight. It was all interesting approach to identify the impact of a certain problem and how people correspond to it. Now let's move to the validation before ending up the presentation. How can I validate my work and prove that it is a high quality scientific work? As we talked before, validation of qualitative research looks at internal validity and external validity. When we look at internal validity, we are looking at credibility and confirmability. It's difficult to generalize findings when we do qualitative research, but still we can look at dependability and we look at transferability. Now we ask ourselves, how can we avoid bias? Because by default, observation and ethnographic research, by default, it is subjective, meaning that it is qualitative, and if it's subjective, we can hardly generalize it. However, we need to avoid bias. We need to avoid bias. So how can we avoid bias in qualitative design? And how can we assure the quality when we do qualitative research? Well, when we do answer this question, we need to carefully choose the sample based on a prior knowledge on the purpose or target sample. We need to use measurement whenever possible. If we can combine what you are doing with measurement, with recordings, with videos, this is bringing high quality to our work. We have to engage in a cyclical hypothesis testing. We need to test our hypothesis, our theory that we built, or even our hypothesis if we are working with a deductive approach. We need to look at, in general, ethnographic research requires a skeptical stance towards the data that goes beyond simple observation. Even if you talk with people and you ask them, people sometimes are unable to provide the insights and explanation. They are unable to tell you what or why they are doing the things. So it is very important that you keep this skeptical approach. You have to be forming your hypothesis about the motivations, the relationships, the patterns, and so on. and test those hypotheses by additional observations. Very important. Also, you can use videos as a tool to obtain objective data. You can use converging methods, methods that are mixed in general and overlapping, like asking questions in different ways to find the difference between the verbal and the behavior, and this is crucial. Most situations are really, it's very interesting in observation research that the behavior of people does not correspond to their verbal expressions. So they say something, but they do something else. And it's very interesting, and it's one of the crucial things when you do observation research is to look at that and try to identify if there is a difference between the verbal and the behavioral data. Also, you can rank your findings according to their importance and according to your confidence in those findings. This is also another way to make sure that you are rigorous in your approach and you say, this finding, I'm highly confident it's true. And you can assess it even with numbers. I think this is almost 90% true. This finding, I'm not so sure about it. I believe it's 60% true. It needs more validation and so on. So ranking your findings is also another interesting technique. And you can look in general for consistency between the setting or the environment. Is what you are proposing or what you're coming out as findings corresponding to the context or not? Does it make sense or not? Also, as part of achieving the validity, when we cannot ignore numbers and we cannot ignore human experience, meaning that it's not only about numbers, human experience is very valuable, and getting insights can be meaningful. With mixed methods here, you can also get the best out of the qualitative and quantitative. So if you are doing your observation and your ethnographic research, and you can come with some measurements, or you come up with videotaping or any quantitative approach, mix it, it can provide credibility. I give you an example. We were investigating some high performance buildings in Brussels, and we looked at how people behave in these buildings, what are the type of profiles, but we also started recording the temperature profiles and humidity, and it was a very easy task to do compared to our behavioral analysis. And this is something called post-occupancy evaluation, for example. So under this post-occupancy evaluation, we mixed two approaches. We did empirical monitoring, which is quantitative, and we did observation and ethnographic research, which is qualitative. And this brings quality, and this can be part of your validation. Now, when we talk about observations and ethnographic research, we must talk about internal reliability. Generally, we talk here about the inter-rater, and the inter-rater reliability is a measure of how consistent an individual is measuring a constant phenomena. And there is something called the inter-rater opposed to the intra-rater. The inter-rater is simply refers to how consistent different individuals are at measuring the same phenomena, and instrument reliability pertains to the tool used to obtain the measurement. So here we are looking at if somebody else is doing the same observation, is she or he going to get the same outcomes or not? And we hardly can use the intra-rater technique when we do observation because it's difficult, because it requires that we redo our field visit and restart our interpretation. This is very difficult, very time consuming, but we can do it either on a small sample or we do it in the beginning to make sure that our method of observation is systematic. But the most common to validate the reliability in observation research is to do the inter-rater. So we can invite, if possible, one person, if possible, during our observation and check what will be their own observation, and we start to cross-check the differences and do comparisons. So the intra-rater looks at the consistency of the grading, how I did my observation for a single thing, while the inter-rater looking at the correlation between the scores of two different people. And sometimes we ask people to observe a phenomena, two raters, when we do inter-rater, and we ask them to give a grade, for example, to quantify it, and we see the differences. So this is a way to calculate and validate reliability. And there is a very famous method called the Kappa score method, which is developed by Cohen-Kappa, which is a method where Cohen-Kappa developed a coefficient, K, which is a statistic that is used to measure the inter-rater reliability and simply look at the items that are in your work. So there is a controversy surrounding Cohen's Kappa for sure due to the difficulty of interpreting indices of agreement, and it measures the agreement between two raters, and the definition of K is simply this equation where we are looking at the difference between rater 1 and rater 2 in order to check how far there is an agreement or a disagreement on their judgment on observing the same phenomena. So with the row 0, the relative observed agreement among raters looks at the accuracy, and the row E is looking at the hypothetical probability of chance and agreement. So this is the equation. You can find it on internet if interested, and the definition simply is looking at the difference between the observed first rater assessment and the second rater assessment and the observed agreement, and they quantify it in this equation. So in general, there is a magnitude of guidelines presenting the variety level. If it's less than 0.44, then there is no agreement between the two inter-raters. They are so different in judging this phenomena. If it's between 0.4 0.59, it's fair. If it's 0.6 and 0.75, it's good. And if it's more than 0.75, then it's excellent, meaning that both inter-rater are agreeing on the same, rating the same phenomena. So this can be simply like, we are observing, I give you an example. We are observing the behavior of pedestrians, okay? And we will stay 1 hour today, two observers will stay on a cross point where there is a pedestrian, zebra pedestrian marking, and people are crossing this pedestrian marking, but there is a traffic light. And this traffic light is giving them the signs of crossing or not crossing. So what we want to do is that we want to assess, or we want to observe, are people respecting the traffic lights and crossing this zebra marking only when it's green, or they are not respecting the traffic lights and most of them are crossing when it's red. The two observers will stay for a certain while, they will develop a certain technique of observation, and they will give a score. They will say, people are crossing on red, what do you give a score? You say, I think it is 80% people do it. The other scorer says 70% do it. Here we have a high agreement between both observers for this phenomena. So with the Kappa score method, we can find that the inter-raters both agree and they have an excellent agreement on judging this phenomena. While if they are having a grade below 0.4, somebody gave a 0 and somebody gave a 0.7 or a 0.6, then the correlation will be poor. Somebody is fully going, is saying yes and somebody is saying no. And by that we can use two people to observe the same phenomena, judge it, assess it with a number, and look in a very simple way at assessing the agreement and the reliability of their judgment for the observation. This is very technical, but I leave you with some examples for some papers online, developing a reliable senior walking environment assessment by Gracia, for example, and different authors. This is an interesting paper if you want to look at. Another paper here in the preventive medicine, revising the senior walking environmental assessment tool by Yvonne Michael and other authors. So you can look at those examples and learn from them if you want to quantify your approach of observation. However, the Kappa method and the Kappa score is not necessarily always to be used when you do qualitative research. It depends on the type of observation, the type of phenomenon. If it's a small thing or a very specific observation and you want to judge it, assess it, then you can use the score. But if you are going to ethnographic approaches, less than observational one, you will go with different techniques we talked before. Also, as part of the validity, you have to look at your sampling. You need to make sure that you have a good content, how you select your content, what will be your sampling method. You must assure saturation and homogeneity, and you have to construct the validity by using previous variables and categories and testing new ones in your interpretation actually when you do the observation, and you have to research that your research question is answered from your observations. Now I would like to wrap up the presentation with some takeaway methods so that you can start working with this methodology and apply it. First of all, keep the research question always nearby. In ethnographic and observation research, you can easily get lost because you will have situations where we are living for days or months or weeks with people, and sometimes you can easily get flowed or you get distracted by the lifestyle and you forget your research question. So your research question should be always in front of you. You should always reminding yourself, what is the research question? Assuming that you already validated your research question and you based it on a literature review, a proper literature review, and based on a knowledge gap identification and a problem identification. Observation and ethnographic techniques are time consuming depending on the case, so take this into account. Observational research does not have to be exclusively qualitative. If you can mix it with quantitative methods, it will be very useful. Don't underestimate the power of the current tools and software and the smartphones that we are using that have a lot of sensors, have a lot of devices. Select your data sources wisely and conduct your fieldwork as soon as possible. Don't delay your fieldwork to the end of your project or to the end of the study. Start fieldwork as soon as possible. If you are in a research project, if you are doing a research paper, do the fieldwork first. And then from there, you can estimate and assess the potential of success, the importance of your findings, how to report them, how to interpret them, and don't forget the 3 steps of descriptions, finding relations, and finally interpretation and finding deep meaningfuls. Thank you for your attention. Don't forget also to have content analysis, which is strongly dependent on identifying the key knowledge gap. Researchers must create a highly logical coding. So here the added value. Are you going to do interpretation of your observations and link them to added value? What is the added value of your observations? Are you sure that what you are finding here is relevant? Are you sure it was not found in literature? Are you sure it's bringing insights? These are all questions you need to keep into account when you report your observations outcomes. You need to learn from other journal papers. I always advise you to look at researches that are done using this method. It can be in social sciences or in different other domains like we explained earlier. And emotional intelligence is very important in this type of studies because you will be in situations where most probably maybe you are abroad, you are in a different country, you are in a different culture, maybe you are observing something, you are not knowing the local language, and it can be very sensitive, it can be very dangerous sometimes. So emotional intelligence can make you avoid risks, and you need to pass all the ethical committee permissions and so on to make sure that you are not falling in risk, and you have to respect these ethical concerns in general. And I'll just give you the last word on the banana. It was simple as that in some situations that one of my students who was doing his observations in Peru, and he was only getting access to talk with people and take pictures of their houses and stay with them, drink a coffee or drink a tea, just by having some bananas with him and giving these bananas to the kids in the street. So sometimes these situations shows an emotional intelligence where you explain to the people, I just want to have an experience to live with you, drink with you, talk with you, get some pictures. I am doing this research, I'm doing that research. You need to have for sure a kind of legal document or some certain permission. If it's possible, you talk with a local authority in the context. You can even report to the local police before you do your work to make sure that there is no problem or violation of any law. But it is important here, the emotional intelligence and the banana. It's simple as that. You can easily invite people for conversation. You can invite them for a coffee, for a tea. You get them in a cafe to get access to them. And these techniques end up by sometimes calling the people and telling them, can I have an interview for you? Some people will tell you, you are welcome, come to my house. And instead of staying half an hour, you end up staying 4 hours because it's a nice conversation. The people are so nice. And sometimes it ends up that the person tells you, yeah, but you cannot come to my house. You tell them, okay, I can invite you to the cafe in the corner in the neighborhood where you live, and you take them in this cafe and you talk to them and you start to do your interpretations or your interviews to start to come up with your answer to your question. So it's very important to keep into account these techniques, and it's depending on the emotional intelligence. If you are somebody who is easily talking to people, somebody is willing to listen, somebody who is able to go deeper, then ethnographic research methods and observation is a good technique to use for your research. Well, don't forget to look at previous videos related to qualitative research method, and by that I would like to thank you for watching this presentation on observation and ethnographic research. Thank you for your attention.